Hello there, I'm LRJ Chess and welcome back to my final lesson on my series of opening strategies. In this one, we're going to be looking at a bunch of opening variations. We're finally getting into the actual openings. After all of the strategies that we've gone through, after the basic moves, the starting moves, the strategies, and everything, we're going to be looking at variations. But I have one caveat for you. I'm not going to be going through every single line and variation. I'm not going to go and make this a theory video. If you want that, you can look elsewhere. There have been many grandmasters and strong players that have made instructional videos about a specific opening and explained every single variation. Instead, I'm going to give you the main overview. Many of these openings are ones that I've played myself throughout my career, or ones that I've faced countless times in tournament play. At this stage in your chess journey, memorizing specific opening variations honestly isn't that important. Instead, all you need is to have a good blueprint of where your pieces need to go in the opening. So because of that, I want to go over some of the most common openings that you might face in a tournament game, or even just a casual game, so that you know what the main ideas are. As I said before, we're not going to be looking at the specific variations, in some cases because that would be far too long and the video would easily exceed an hour, but because you don't actually need that yet. As long as you have a good base understanding of the variation and the opening and where your pieces should go in that opening, I think you'll do just fine. And at the same time, as I go through these openings, if there's a specific one that you really like, you can leave it down in the comments below and I can make a follow-up video about it. Or even better, you could study that opening on your own. There's so many resources online that I'll be sure to highlight later on in this video. And as one final note with this opening lesson video, I'm not going to be looking at traps and gambits. Well, on the contrary, I will be looking at one because I played it and I think it's pretty good. But back to the traps, I won't be showing you all the little traps in this video. That might be saved for the future, but more importantly, I'm more focused on refuting them. You're here to learn how to play good chess, so these little traps aren't made for this video. So with that, I'm going to be focusing on the main ideas. I'm going to make sure you understand the ideas of these openings and know where your pieces should go. And for that, we're going to head on over into the board and I'm going to show you all these openings one by one. Let's get started. Okay, so we'll get started with the basic openings that you already know. We've looked through a couple of these already, so they will act as good review for you if you choose to play these openings. We'll start with the Italian game. While the name of the opening may not seem familiar, the moves definitely will. It starts e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then bishop c4, which is the Italian game. Here, black has two options. He can play the move knight f6, developing a piece and attacking the e4 pawn, or he could choose a different move, like bishop to c5. This also develops a piece and attacks the center, and gets the king one step closer to castling. Both of them are good moves, and they usually transpose. For example, after d3 and then knight f6, you see the position would be the exact same if black had played knight f6, white went d3, and then black played bishop to c5. The variations transposed. They took a different route to get to the same exact position. You may have quickly noticed there was an arrow over here, and this was just me highlighting that when white plays the move d3, he's not only guarding the e4 pawn, but he's also opening up his bishop. You may be wondering, why does white play the move d3 over the move knight c3? Knight c3 develops a piece and defends the pawn, so it technically does slightly better than d3. However, this is actually a mistake because there is a common opening trap that black can play in this position. It's not really a trap in that it will win the game for black immediately, but it's something to watch out for. So I'm going to highlight it here, and in the future when we're looking at the Italian game, I'll be sure to mention it as well. I call it the center fork trick. Some other people may have different names for it, but the point is that black can play the move knight takes e4. And this may look crazy because it's giving up a piece right away. White can play knight takes e4. But then black plays the move d5, simultaneously attacking the bishop and the knight. One of these pieces will have to move, and then black will capture the other. If white chooses to capture the pawn, the queen will retake. So material is now equal, but the big difference is that black has slightly better control over the center, because he has one pawn in the center compared to 0 for white. This trick that black can play has given him a slightly better position. Normally, white should be the one with a slightly better position because he starts first. That's why d3 is better than knight c3. Knight c3 can be played on the next move because now this trick doesn't work, as you can recapture the knight with your pawn, and there's no fork or double attack to be played with pawn to d5. So back in this position, when black plays bishop c5, white can play knight c3 now. Black castles, white castles, d6, let's say h3, just preventing a pin from happening here. White could have also played bishop g5 himself and create this attack. The knight can no longer move because the queen would get taken. But the point is, in a position like this, although it may look incredibly symmetrical, with both sides having played the same exact moves, albeit in a slightly different order, white still gets the first move, so they are able to change the position if they decide to. As a conclusion for this opening, notice how both sides have developed their pieces to active squares and control the center. They both castled, and they protected their pieces. Every single piece on the board, with exception of the rooks on a1 and a8, are currently defended by another piece. That's very important. The next step will be to complete the development, as in moving out the c1 bishop, moving out your queen, and moving out your a1 rook into the game. In the future, white's plan may be to try and open up the center by playing d4, only after bringing his pieces to support that square. I think this is a good opening to play for both sides, whether you're white or black, because it directly follows the opening principles, and it gives you a good game right out of the opening. There's nothing really special that you have to learn. You just focus on developing your pieces and make sure that you're keeping an eye out for what your opponent's threats are, because you never want to miss a threat that your opponent may make. This is the Italian game. Another opening you may see stems from the Italian game and may look very similar to something that we've looked at in the past. That's the move b4. This is the Evans Gambit. Now, you may be coming off of the video I posted about the Halloween Gambit and why most traps and gambits are bad. However, the Evans Gambit, in my opinion, is one gambit that is actually good. White sacrifices a pawn for clear reasons. He gets fast development, more control over the center, and the ability to make a quick attack. As looked at in the pawn sacrifice video, that is a good sacrifice, so this is a good opening. If you don't want to play the Evans Gambit, you could instead choose to castle or play pawn to d3 instead, and both of these moves are also good because they follow opening principles. You will most likely transpose to the position we just looked at in the Italian game. However, for those of you who love attacking and want to immediately try and checkmate your opponent right out of the gate, the Evans Gambit will probably be for you. Now, I will give you one little warning. Since this is a gambit, you are sacrificing material. If you do not win it back or attack your opponent quickly enough, you will be losing in material as the game goes on. Keep that in mind, just in case. Black will most likely capture the pawn. Then white will follow with c3 and d4, getting control over the center. As the pawn captures, white will play castles, and he is ignoring the threats to his pawns because what's much more important to him is the attack and the development. So white's goal is to try and capture in the center, play queen to b3, and attack the center and point at the enemy king. These are some main ideas in the Evans Gambit. Now there are a lot of different things that black can do. He could also play this retreating move bishop to e7 and follow up d4 with d6. This actually seems like a decent way to fight against the Evans Gambit because although black looks a bit passive, he has won a pawn and shored up the defense of his center. So now with 2 pieces guarding the e5 pawn, black gets to keep a stake in the center, not something that happens in other variations of the Evans Gambit. So if this is an opening you would like to play, you can check out my last couple where we looked at the sacrifices in the Evans Gambit. But for now, we're going to move on to the next opening. This next one is the Ruy Lopez, probably one of the most popular openings of all time. And it's the move bishop to b5. This is different from the Italian game where white played bishop to c4, but this is still a good opening move because the initial idea is to capture the knight, removing the defender of the e5 pawn. There are so many variations in the Ruy Lopez. Authors have written books that were 200, 300 pages long, and it didn't even cover the entire opening. It focused on one main variation. Just thinking about that, maybe you could start to see how big this opening is. I mean, if we just had to scroll through some moves, I would say knight to f6 is the most popular. It develops a piece and counterattacks the center. But a lot of people will throw in a6 first to try and attack the bishop, not worried about this capture and losing this pawn, because they can play the double attack queen d4 and win their pawn right back. While it is moving the queen out early, since it will directly win material, I think it's okay. Also notice how white had moved his knight twice and will now have to move it a 3rd time. So in return of moving the queen out early, white has broken the opening principle of not moving a piece multiple times. Both sides have done it for good reasons, so that's why it's still okay. Most likely what would happen is white would play bishop to a4. Play could continue normally, like with knight to f6, or pawn to b5 attacking the bishop again. The idea is just to see how many different variations could happen with one move change. We'll focus on knight f6, but before getting there, just notice how black could play a bunch of different moves like knight to e7. While it is developing a piece, it's not as good as knight f6, but it does guard the knight on c6 to be able to recapture with a knight instead of a pawn. Another option is d6, which simply moves a pawn to guard the e5 pawn. Both of these moves have been played before many times. But one of the most common moves is knight to f6, so that's what we'll focus on. White here can play the move d3, similar to the Italian game and just guarding the pawn. Knight c3 is actually possible because the bishop is on b5 and not c4. However, the most common move is simply castling. White can ignore the attack on the e4 pawn, the idea being he can respond rook to e1, attacking the knight and also looking at the e5 pawn behind it and the king behind that. Black may respond with knight to d6, an odd looking move, but it does attack the bishop on b5. White can still capture this pawn. The idea being, if the bishop is taken, he can play this great move knight takes c6, which is actually check. Notice how the knight moving uncovered the rook to attack the king. This is a tactic called a discovered check, which we will look at in much more detail later on. That's why black would probably play bishop to e7, now actually threatening to capture on b5. White retreats his bishop. A knight trade happens on e5. Black castles, white plays d4, and then retreats his rook. Notice how there's not really anything special going on here. Both sides have castled. White controls the center. Black's pieces look a little weird, but this is still a popular opening line. One of the reasons why I don't play the Ruy Lopez is simply because there are too many variations. You would spend way too long learning all of these opening variations, and if you don't know them fully well 100%, you're probably going to fall into a worse position. However, there is one more line that I want to show you in the Ruy Lopez. That's the move d4. So this will still get the pawn back, simply because if pawn captures, it opens up the king, and this could be very dangerous after rook to e1. So what happens is knight d6. Once again, this is going to start to look a little weird, but we're going to get into a position called the Berlin Defense. This is an incredibly common opening at the top level where both sides will trade queens and play into this endgame. Now, some of the moves may look weird, but if you study top player games and you see the Ruy Lopez, you are definitely going to see the Berlin, which is this sub-variation of the Ruy Lopez. I added it here just for completion, but I do want to make sure you know that I've only scratched the surface of the Ruy Lopez. There is a huge iceberg of opening knowledge and variations that you could dive into if this is an opening that you would want to choose. However, for beginners and even intermediate players and some advanced players, I wouldn't even recommend the Ruy Lopez. I think there are too many lines. I think some of the lines are complicated, and I think you can get a very simple position with a good opening playing different moves. So I'd stick to the Italian, the Evans Gambit, or one of the other lines that I'll show in the future. So far, we've been looking at these e4, e5 openings with knight f3 and knight c6. But that's not the only thing that can be played here. Sure, some players have tried to play d5 or f5 as gambits, ones which we will be able to refute in a later video. But for right now, I want to focus on the move knight f6. This is called the Petrov Defense. White will, of course, capture the pawn on e5, and now black plays the move d6 and kicks the knight away before taking back on e4. There's a very specific reason for this, because if the knight takes on e4, he's walking a very thin line that can lead to a quick defeat after queen e2. Notice how the queen looks at the king, and it's behind these two knights. If the black knight moves, white will play a similar discovered check tactic like in that variation of the Ruy Lopez, and he would win the black queen, because the queen now puts the king in check, and the knight attacks the queen at the same time. So there's no time to capture the knight. White wins this game. To stop this, black would have to play queen to e7, but then white would capture the knight. Black would play d6. The knight can't move because that would let the queen get taken for free. So white needs to defend the knight and let it fall, but at the very end, he has won a pawn. Notice how white has taken the e-pawn and the d-pawn, while black has only taken the e-pawn. So white has an extra pawn right out of the opening after only 7 moves. That's a success. That's why black, in this position, has to kick the knight away. and then he can capture the pawn on e4. If white plays queen e2 just like before, black will respond queen e7, blocking the queen from eyeing the king and also defending his knight. This is okay for black, even if it looks weird. There are many things that can happen in this position. The two most common ones are d4 and knight c3. The point of knight c3 is to develop a piece and attack the knight, so when the knights are traded, white will be able to open up the game for his other pieces, being able to play bishop f4, queen d2, and even castle on the queen side. White is announcing his aggressive intentions because he will want to attack the black king. Notice how the white pieces are pointed toward the king. This might be a recipe for an attack later on. At the same time, if you don't feel comfortable attacking but still want to do this, notice how you could easily finish your development, get your king to safety, and then just keep developing your pieces. White still has good control over the center and more activity, so this should be fine. A lot of players will choose d4 instead of knight c3, and this is to open up their queenside bishop and be able to play bishop d3 without blocking the pawn. After knight c6, castles, bishop e7, white plays the move c4 with the idea of trying to attack the center even further. Notice how the pawn cannot be captured because this would lose the knight on e4. These lines might start to look a little odd at first, but I still want you to notice how white has developed his pieces, gotten his king to safety, and started attacking the center. So he's still following good opening principles. White may also play d3, simply to kick the knight away before playing d4. However, this just leads to a symmetrical position. And over here, you may start to see why the draw rate is so high compared to winning or losing this game. When both sides copy their moves, it's hard to find a way to attack and find an inroad. It's not always a great idea to copy your opponent, but so far, all the copied moves have developed a piece or gotten the king to safety. So far it's fine. This is a little intro on the Petrov, and there are a lot of strong players that use this opening. It's definitely one that you could add to your arsenal if you want something simpler than knight c6 and the Italian game as black. Now, of course, e5 isn't the only option to e4. There are so many other moves possible. Looking one pawn over, black could play the move d5. We have seen this move before. The idea is that after white captures on d5, black has a choice between recapturing the pawn and playing knight f6. If you remember my video on pawn sacrifices, you'll know that I definitely prefer this variation, the one with knight f6 and bishop g4, because it prioritizes quick development and attacks. However, a lot of people will capture this pawn with their queen. Now I want to show you a couple lines why this isn't a great idea. Of course, white will start with knight c3, attacking the queen. There are 5 spots that most players choose to put their queen. a5 is the most common, d6 is the second most common, and then d8 and e5 are the 2 worst. The reason why queen e5 is the worst is because black is attacking only with his queen. And since it's out so early, it can be attacked by developing pieces and forced to move again. Notice how the black queen has already moved 3 times, and white has been able to develop 2 different pieces to attack the queen. So he got 2 free developing moves. White is better. If black plays queen d8, all he's really doing is moving his queen back to his starting square. So white can develop another piece and control the center, and he essentially has gotten 2 free moves from the queen going to d5 and coming back to its starting square. Once again, white is better simply by following opening principles. If the queen goes to d6, the idea is to keep it active. However, this can also lead to it getting attacked later on. There's nothing special here. White continues with the same exact strategy. Develop pieces, get the king to safety, continue the game. White is perfectly fine. The only thing you have to be worried about when your opponent plays queen a5 is that after you control the center with d4, you have to worry about this, in that your knight cannot move because you would be in check. If the knight tried to move anywhere, it would be an illegal move because the queen would be checking the king. But that won't be a problem. White will continue by developing his pieces and even blocking this attack with bishop to d2. Now the knight can actually move anywhere to e2, to e4, even to an attacked square like d5, because white is opening up the bishop to counterattack the queen. So the queen may move so it doesn't get attacked. White castles, puts his rook on a semi-open file, and once again has a pretty good position. The fact that black needed 3 moves to move his queen, while white chose developing moves, is a clear reason why the mainline Scandinavian isn't that great of an option. Moving on, we now have my favorite opening, which is the Sicilian Defense. Against the Sicilian, there are so many different choices. This is one of the biggest openings in all of chess. White can start with knight f3 using simple development. There's also knight c3, the closed Sicilian, pawn c3, the Alapin opening, pawn d4, the Smith-Morra Gambit, which is another one of those decent gambits that you could choose. So those are all different ways that you could start out. But we'll focus on knight f3. Now, for black, he could play knight c6, d6, e6, knight f6, and g6. All of these moves will go into different Sicilian lines. That's already going to be a lot to study. But against any of these moves, with exception of knight f6, because it attacks the e4 pawn, you will play the move d4. So if knight c6, for example, you'll play d4. And the idea is to open up your pieces and also stake a claim in the center after pawn takes and knight takes. Your opponent may play g6, planning to develop the bishop on g7, or they may play knight f6, developing a piece and attacking the pawn on e4, but either way, white will continue with a similar development. You bring your knight out, you bring your bishops out, you make sure your knight on d4 is protected, and then you get your king to safety. One of the most common lines in all of the Sicilians is one called the Najdorf, which is after d6, d4, take, knight f6, knight c3, and a6. This is a very good opening choice. However, it is very theory heavy, which means if you're going to choose to play this, you have to do a lot of opening studying. That's probably not going to be a good idea at the beginning of your chess career. My favorite variation of the Sicilian is playing g6. This is called the accelerated dragon. Some people even call it the hyper-accelerated dragon. And the whole idea is to be able to get this bishop onto g7. This is called a fianchetto, where you move up your g-pawn or your b-pawn on the queen side. Your bishop goes inside this little house of pawns and looks from the outside toward the center. A fianchettoed bishop also helps to be an extra defender to your king, because as we move forward in this line, something that you can see is that when black castles, like in this position, he now has a piece instead of a pawn guarding him. And right in front of that bishop is a pawn. So black essentially gets an extra defender. The Sicilian is absolutely giant, so if this is going to be an opening that you want to look at, then I suggest you pick a specific line, focus only on that line, and then find a book or some strong players' games that you can use to study that line. But that's not nearly the end of the story. After e4, there are still so many other options that your opponent can play, many which are seen even at the top level. Your opponent may choose e6, which is the French defense. They may choose c6, which is the Caro-Kann defense. They may choose d6, which is the Perk defense. They may choose g6, which is the modern defense. Some of them may even choose b6, which is the Owens defense. If your opponent is feeling a little silly, they might choose a6, which is the St. George defense. Besides pawn moves, the knights could also move for their first turn. Knight f6 is called the Alekhines defense. You may recognize that name because Alexander Alekhine was a chess world champion. Another one is knight c6, which becomes the Nimzowitsch defense. They definitely do seem to have funny names, and that's because the person who created them gets to attach their name to it, or if it was played in a certain place for the first time, then that place is the name. There are a bunch of different things for why an opening is named for how it is. But for right now, all you need to know is what to do against them. As you can see, there are a bunch of openings, but if you focus on your opening strategies and make sure you have an idea what your opponent is threatening, you'll do fine no matter what opening your opponent plays. But e4 is not the only option that you need to start the game. You could also play knight f3 as discussed as one of the best 3 moves. But this goes into something called the Reti, and I don't really like this opening for beginners, and the reason why is because it's difficult to attack the center. White does develop his pieces, let's say, but the problem is that he doesn't really have any central control. He'll probably play d4 in the future, but he cannot play e4 because that square is attacked too much. The Reti still develops pieces and gets your king to safety, but it doesn't control the center, so I don't really like it. Usually, knight f3 is used as a way to transpose into something with d4. And speaking of something with d4, that's what we'll look at next, because d4 is the second most common opening move. So now, black has 2 options here. He can play d5, or he can play knight f6. These are the 2 most common moves that you'll see. Both moves prevent white from playing e4, getting the 2-pawn center. White can now play the move c4, which is the start of the queen's gambit. So this is called a gambit, but it's not really a gambit like the Evans, because if the pawn is captured on c4, you are going to be getting this pawn back very quickly. White can play e4, now getting that 2-pawn center because the pawn that was on d5 moved away. And this also opens up the light-squared bishop to attack the c4 pawn. Let's say black plays knight f6, attacking the pawn. White can play knight c3, and then capture the pawn on c4. Black plays bishop to b4, attacking the knight and looking at the enemy king, so bishop g5, attacking the knight and looking at the enemy queen. Notice here how both sides are developing their pieces. White will most likely continue with knight f3 and castle's kingside, but the important thing to realize here is that white has pieces developed, he has the center controlled, and he can continue with a clear idea. So far, this has been a successful opening. This is the Queen's Gambit accepted. What about the Queen's Gambit declined? In this one, black plays the same way to start, but then does not take the pawn on c4. Instead, opting for something like c6. e6 is also possible, but the reason why I chose c6 over e6 is because this move blocks the bishop. Now it's stuck. With c6, the bishop still has a free roaming area. It can go to e6, f5, or g4, squares that it did not have access to if the pawn moved to e6 instead. So here, both sides will continue developing their pieces, and there are many lines in the Queen's Gambit declined. So many so, if I pull up the opening online database, you will see that 92,000 games have been played with the move e6, 54,000 with the move d takes c4, 23,000 with the move a6, and you get the point. There are a lot of games in this opening, especially by the greatest players in the world. So because of this, if you choose to play the Queen's Gambit, know that it will be slightly more positional than e4 openings. You won't be attacking as much, but it definitely is a good opening to choose. If we take a look from Black's side against d4, instead of playing d5, he can choose to play knight f6. Now, this may be a little tricky because Black is giving up control of the center, instead prioritizing quick piece development while White makes pawn moves in the center. White plays c4, Black plays g6 to develop his bishop, and now he has an initial choice. If he plays bishop g7, that allows White to get this 3-pawn center. However, this is called the King's Indian Defense, which is one of the most popular openings. Players like Bobby Fischer and Garry Kasparov have used this opening with massive success. Another option is to play the immediate pawn d5, to take a claim in the center and start attacking. This is called the Grunfeld defense. However, White can capture the pawn, play the move e4, and build up this really strong center. Black, in return, will try and argue that he can attack the center from afar and prove that White has made too many pawn moves. Sometimes it works and the center falls, and sometimes it doesn't, and Black just gets overrun by a massive central disadvantage. So, it's really up to you to decide whether you think you can do that or not. Right now, I would say the Grunfeld is not for beginning or intermediate players. I did play the Grunfeld in my career, but that was toward the later end. Normally, I stick to the King's Indian, which, as a reminder, is the one with bishop to g7. Another opening you could play does not include g6, but the move c5. This is called the Benoni, and after White plays the move d5, you can respond with b5, which is called the Benko Gambit. Once again, even though this is a gambit, in my opinion, it is a good gambit. It's a little bit more advanced, but it's probably one of my favorite gambits, and I have used the Benko in my career as well, with many successes. This would be an option once you've gotten to the intermediate or slightly more advanced levels. I would definitely recommend as a secondary option to something like the King's Indian Defense or a d5 opening. So that just about covers all of the main openings. It's been a really long review session with all of the different lines and variations, and I want you to know that I've just scratched the surface. We'll be looking at a lot more of these lines in a lot more depth in future videos. But for right now, let's go back to the main lesson. Okay, we're back. And just as a simple reminder, if there were any openings in those that we reviewed that you really enjoyed, leave a comment down below and I'll make a more in-depth video on that, where I will actually go through the theory and explain those lines. At the same time, if there was an opening that we didn't cover that you would like to see covered, let me know as well. I can make a follow-up video to this looking at different openings. In my opinion, I started with the important openings that you'll see most often, the ones that are most common, of course. However, that's not nearly all of the openings. I did not cover everything. So if there's something specific that you would like, just let me know and I'll get that one made. Now at the same time, if one of these openings really stuck with you and you want to learn it further, you want to make it a part of your opening repertoire, here are some things that you can do to learn openings better. These are my top 3 recommendations that I tell all of my students. First, you can simply buy a book on the opening. If you haven't realized already, there are thousands of amazing chess books. YouTube and social media and online resources aren't the only way that you can learn about chess. The old-fashioned way with books and a board is amazing. It's honestly my preferred way. So what I would recommend is finding a good book on your opening, one that focuses more on the explanations and ideas rather than the specific theory. There are definitely opening encyclopedias that will cycle through every single opening variation and line, and it'll be 500 pages. Now, why would you want to read that? If you're a master level player, I would understand. You need to have 1,000% confidence in your openings. If you're just getting started, I find it highly unlikely that you would be able to play those lines at all. Your opponent would deviate. You would not get to those variations in the book. All you need is to understand the main ideas of the line. Because if you do that and your opponent plays some wild or weird move, it doesn't matter. You know the main ideas, and you're going to be able to figure out the right move to do, even if your opponent ventures off the beaten path. For book recommendations, it can differ from player to player, but I really like the Starting Out series by Everyman Chess. Now this series has a whole collection of authors. It's not just written by one player. There will be grandmasters or international masters that specialize in a specific opening and will write that book for Everyman Chess in the Starting Out series. One of the reasons why I like this series so much is that it only shows the basic lines. It won't go super deep into every variation. You'll learn the main ideas, the important lines, and you'll look at some example games. I think that's a perfect way to learn an opening at the very beginning. After that, you can go on to more in-depth books or more complicated ones if you want to learn even more. But that's also a great segue into the second recommendation that I have, studying master games. Now, if you want to play an opening, you want to find a model player and learn from their games. For me, I loved playing the Sicilian. I still do. So some of the players I look at are grandmasters that specialize in the Sicilian Defense. I study their games and I can better understand the ideas and the reasons behind their moves in the Sicilian. If you're not a Sicilian player, this won't apply to you. But for any opening that you pick, you'll want to find a specific player or a collection of players that play that opening at the highest level so you can study them. Now, the only downside is that competitive chess at the top level has given way to many computer variations. A lot of these players will stick the variation and the opening in the computer and just let the engine run until it finds the best move. What that means is if you study the top players like Magnus, Nakamura, or anyone in the top 10 or top 20, even the top 50, you're going to encounter a lot of engine lines. And what I mean by that is you're going to encounter a lot of lines where the move that's played just doesn't make sense. If that ever happens to you, feel free to ask a question. You can DM me on Instagram, comment in this video, whatever you want. You can contact me, tell me the line, tell me the move, and I can help explain it to you. That's something you might run into a lot if you're going to be looking at the top players. For example, one player you could look at is Fabiano Caruana, one of the best American players right now. I would say he specializes in the Petrov Defense. We looked at that one a little while ago. That was with e4, e5, knight f3, and then knight f6, instead of knight c6, defending the e5 pawn. Now, Fabiano has played this Petrov Defense for a long time, and he mastered it for the World Championship match against Magnus Carlsen. So studying his games in the Petrov would be amazing. He's probably one of, if not the best players to master the Petrov Defense. However, since he is one of the top 5 players in the world, it might be hard to understand some of his moves. But studying his games will definitely help you improve in your opening. And lastly, a third way that you can practice and learn openings is by using the Explorer function on chess.com. If you don't know what that is, you're in for a surprise, because I think this is one of the most useful tools that chess.com has to offer. On a side note, if you haven't checked out chess.com already, you really need to. This is probably the best tool to improve your chess. I've talked about it before. I will continue talking about it in the future. I'm not sponsored by chess.com, but that won't stop me from giving you the best chess resources. Before moving on, I want to explain to you how the Explorer tool works so you can take advantage of it when studying openings or studying any of your games. Let's move on from me talking about openings and take a look at this Opening Explorer tool. So this is the chess.com Explorer function. To get here, go to More and then click on Explorer. You'll get to a screen that looks like this, and there are 3 main sections. First, of course, is the board. You can move the pieces here by clicking and dragging, and that will also update the right side, which you just saw move. What this section is a collection of all of the moves that were played in the position on the board, along with the number of games and the win percentage. This is white's winning percentage, this is the draw percentage, and this is black's winning percentage. So as you can see, e4 has been played 1.8 million times, with a 38% win for white, a 30% draw, and a 32% loss, or win for black. Now, this doesn't show all of the games, of course. This is specifically going to be under Master Games. You can also choose to look at your own games if you have a chess.com account, or you can look at other players' games and put in their account. We'll stick to Master Games right now, and we can even look at a certain grandmaster. Let's go with Magnus Carlsen. You type in his name, you click here, and now all of the games it will show will be Magnus's games where he was playing as white. So let's take a look at some. e4, and let's say the opponent plays c5, which is the Sicilian. We see here that Magnus mostly plays knight f3. So if you click on the move, it will play it on the board. And the section over here updates to show you all of the different moves his opponents have played. If you're studying a strong player's game, this is a very good way to see which moves are played and what the result is from those games. d6 has been played a little over 200 times in Magnus's games, specifically the ones that chess.com tracks, because he has, of course, faced the Sicilian more than 200 times. But if we continue looking through this variation, I'll keep clicking on the moves, and we'll see how the position evolves. Okay, let's stop right here, and we see that the only move played in this position from Magnus's games was the move castles on the king side, where he won 29% of the games, drew 43% of the games, and lost 29% of the games. The other great thing you can do is click right here on this number, or simply click View All Games from the current position. Since we're looking specifically at Magnus's games, let's click on this 7. What this will take you to is a screen where you can see all of the games he played from that position. So it looks like he played Hans Niemann, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, Ivanchuk, and so on. Now, if you click on one of the games, let's take this one he actually lost. What you will see is it will start the game and you can look through it. Now, if we go through the moves, you will recognize the position we got right over here. This was the opening we were looking at, and now you can go through the game and look at how the game continued. This will help you study a specific opening. If you are in a specific opening variation that you're trying to study and you don't know which move is best, this will be a great tool to show you. Because more often than not, the move played the most amount of times will be the best move, or at least a good move, because a lot of strong players have used it already. Another useful tool you can use on chess.com is the opening function, which is very similar to this explorer function. To get there, you go to More and then Openings. What this will show you is simply an overview of all different openings. You still have that tracker on the side with every first move and their win percentages, but you can also scroll through and see the different variations. If you're interested in any one of them, you can just click on it and look more. Let's say you like the Scotch game, which is one of the openings I play. What I love about the opening function is that it will actually give you a little bit of summary about the opening and then give you more information about it specifically. What I like to do is use the opening function, learn about the opening specifically, watch some videos, and then head on over to the Explorer function and look through actual games. I think that is a great way to practice and learn your openings. But that's all I have for these useful tools on chess.com. We'll come back here many times throughout my videos, and I'll show you all the tools that you can use to improve your chess. Let's go back to the main lesson now. So, with my demonstration of the chess.com Opening Explorer tool concluded, that also ends my 3 recommendations on how to improve your openings. At the same time, this nears the end of our opening lessons. I'm going to pause the opening strategies and games and everything for right now because we have a lot of new material to move on to. However, in the future, I will return because I do want to look at in-depth lines, maybe refute some more traps and gambits, and also show you some that I actually think are good. We'll definitely be doing a lot of review games, and the opening is part of that, so we'll be talking about the opening there too. But we're only going to be returning to these once you have a better grasp of the basic chess knowledge that you need to succeed. What that means is we still have 2 full sections of the game to do, the middle game and the end game. So that's where we're going to be moving on to next. It's time for you to take the next step in your chess journey, and I'll see you there. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. This is LRJ Chess signing off with a checkmate. Have a great day.